Hamas needs a ceasefire because clearly it has to deal with a lot of local opposition to its continued control.
Will Arab states want to put boots on the ground in Gaza?
You need an international stabilization force to go in to fill the vacuum. Who's in charge? Who's calling the shots?
Do you see Hamas exiting the scene?
I don't personally think it's going to be feasible to disarm Hamas in the sense of taking every AK-47 Kalashnikov away from every Hamas fighter. I think we can go for decommissioning of heavy weapons.
Iran and its allied groups do not look the same as they did before October 7th. What would you say is the main flashpoint to watch in the region?
So can Israel transform military success against its adversaries into a long-term diplomatic strategy to stabilize the region?
The ceasefire in Gaza was once again broken on Tuesday night after Israel responded to the killing of a soldier with strikes across the Strip, killing 104 Palestinians and wounding 253 others. This is not the first time that Hamas fighters have fatally attacked Israeli troops, and Israeli forces have retaliated with intensive strikes. Now, as the world waits to see whether the deal will progress to phase 2, several questions remain. Will the US continue to pressure Israel to observe the deal? How involved will the Arab states be? And will regional mediators influence Hamas's thinking about its own future? Here to discuss all of those factors with me is NATO's former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges, Jamie Shea. Jamie, thank you so much for making the time to speak to Middle East Eye today.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation.
So I'll start with the obvious. How hopeful are you about this ceasefire's longevity?
Well, I think it will last as long as the Americans are closely engaged, as long as the Americans keep the kind of pressure on both Hamas and on Israel that they demonstrated in the run-up to the ceasefire. There will probably be a continuing number of violations, but generally it will hold. There is a tendency of Trump to like to declare victory quickly and move on to something else. But on the other hand, it would be a monumental embarrassment for Trump, having declared peace in the Middle East, that big banner behind him in Sharm el-Sheikh, if all of this started to unravel within just a couple of days. So I think at least for the time being, the president and his team are going to stay on this in the hope that, they can iron out some of the differences at the moment regarding the exact positioning of the Israeli forces to prevent these unfortunate incidents of people sort of crossing over into Israeli occupied territory and being shot at, and to put obviously limits on what Hamas can do as it seeks to, on a temporary basis at least, restore some semblance of law and order in Gaza, albeit very much on its own terms. My own sense is that Hamas needs a ceasefire because clearly it has to deal with a lot of local opposition to its continued control over Gaza. It also, of course, is exhausted, has lost a lot of people, lost a lot of tunnels, lost a lot of weapons. And so I think it needs a period to recalibrate and reconstitute. I think, on the other hand, the Israeli Defense Forces also don't see much purpose any longer of fighting in Gaza against a diminishing number of Hamas operatives. And so they too, I think, will be lobbying the government in Jerusalem hard to keep the ceasefire in existence. But both sides remain in very close proximity to each other. It's not very clear where the Israeli line of occupation, the so-called yellow line, really is. Hamas, of course, is using a certain amount of violence against its domestic opponents. So there are all kinds of local issues that can quickly flare up and provoke either side to declare that the ceasefire is over. So I think this is going to take constant sort of day-to-day management, at least for the next few weeks, as we try to move forward beyond the ceasefire, beyond the return of the bodies of the deceased hostages into the so-called phase 2 of this negotiation.
You've taken us through a lot of those factors, and we'll get to Hamas and Israel in a moment. Is there a plan for European and Arab states maybe to ensure that Trump remains engaged on this issue now that phase 2, arguably the hardest part, it still lies ahead?
Phase 1 is still continuing, at least for the time being, and we don't yet have the contours of what phase 2 could look like. There's no automatic follow-on between phase 1 and phase 2, which I think is a weakness of this overall agreement. You obviously need to consolidate a ceasefire very quickly with political and economic and other steps, demilitarization, if it's going to hold. But that, of course, is for the future.
And as you say, you're echoing the views of many countries in the region. Both the UAE and Saudi have threatened to reportedly withhold reconstruction funds if Hamas remains in power. Qatar and Turkey, traditionally more sympathetic to the group, more open to the idea of the group maintaining informal power behind the scenes. I wonder how you see this moment in terms of Hamas's future in the Strip? Like you said, demilitarization is an extraordinarily complex and fraught process. Several countries, for them, the assurance that their money will be a long-term investment is knowing that Hamas will exit the political scene in Gaza and that it will move towards a long-term peace. Do you see Hamas exiting the scene? And do you think Israel would accept a real Gaza-based, authentic Palestinian leadership?
The fact that the Israelis have not allowed Mr. Barghouti to exit prison, along with the nearly 2,000 Palestinian prisoners that were released as part of the ceasefire deal, I think shows that there's still a reluctance on the Israeli side to really allow an authentic Palestinian leadership to emerge that would not be seen, if you like, as the stooge of Israel, a genuinely sort of popular leadership among Palestinians themselves, or which, of course, would not be some remodeled version of the Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas following elections. I think for the time being, frankly, it's going to be difficult to find a Palestinian leadership. Since the demise of Yasser Arafat many years ago, this has, of course, been a constant problem, and one of the reasons why Hamas emerged in the first place. So I think the initial way forward is going to have a technocratic sort of administration, half composed of internationals who have competence in things like water management, sewage, supplies, finance and banking system, infrastructure, but with a sufficient number of different Palestinians from different areas to have some credibility with the local population. Now, with Hamas, I don't personally think it's going to be feasible to disarm Hamas in the sense of taking every AK Kalashnikov away from every Hamas fighter. This would be difficult. It would take years. And indeed, resistance movements only really give up their weapons when they are convinced that there is a viable political process. So if I can use the Northern Ireland model with you today, Tamara, I think we can go for decommissioning of heavy weapons, the rockets that Hamas, the Katyushas and others have been firing into Sderot and Israeli towns on the border for many years. Certainly those things, which of course also are seen as a direct threat by Israel, and sort of things like handguns, which it's very, very difficult to pin down. They're hidden underground and the rest. So decommissioning rather than disarmament is a more realistic goal. The heavy weapons, military vehicles, the tunnel complex, everything that allows Hamas to pose some kind of threat, a residual threat still to Israel. Of course, this should be possible because Iran has not been able to supply Hamas now for some considerable time, and its stocks of these rockets, even though it's still been firing them, it will be considerably depleted vis-a-vis what it once was. The other thing is that, just like in Northern Ireland, what we need to do is recognize that Hamas does represent one strand of Palestinian opinion. It may not be very popular among Palestinians in Gaza now because, of course, of the way in which it carried out the October the 7th massacre, mismanagement of Gaza, the fact that it's kept the war against Israel going for much longer than the Palestinians would have hoped, but it does have a following. It does have a following, just like, Sinn Féin, IRA, have had a following in Irish politics, or the Basques have had a following in Spain for many years. It does represent a fringe of opinion. So I think the idea is, rather than to see Hamas sort of disappear entirely off the map, would be that it gradually transforms, like other armed resistance movements elsewhere, from a military organization essentially to a political organization. There are different strands in Hamas, some more willing to cooperate than others. Certainly, of course, the armed resistance in Gaza has been more hardline than the civilian leadership in Qatar in recent years. So I think, it's going to be very important that the Israelis also have a realistic attitude towards the continuation of Hamas alongside others in terms of a political movement that, of course, can contest free and fair elections when it would be possible to organize them at a future date. But, of course, the issue of who speaks for the Palestinians, both on the West Bank, in Gaza, outside the territories, I think is going to continue to be an issue for some time to come. And I think, the Palestinian Authority clearly isn't yet, despite what Mahmoud Abbas may have said at the United Nations, isn't in a position to take the reins of power and run Gaza. It had an opportunity to do that before 2006 and made a bit of a mess of it, which is why Hamas emerged. So I think we're going to have to talk about a kind of representative series of Palestinians across the spectrum who are willing and able to work with the more technocratic authority, at least for a 5-year period, until after elections, some more sort of credible Palestinian authority, which which is also willing to work with Israel, can emerge and which could take over authority for the future.
Trump can't do this alone. European and especially Arab states in the region would play a much stronger role. One is the International Stabilization Force, and the second would be reconstruction. Will Arab states want to put boots on the ground in Gaza? Will they be keen to provide money to Gaza, given that that's essentially an investment in its long-term future, something that seems very uncertain at the moment?
I think the Arab states will be cautious on both counts, frankly. The first issue, of course, is that the Israelis are still occupying well over 50% of the territory of Gaza and are unlikely to pull back totally to the border before October the 7th, 2 years ago, to allow the International Stabilization Force to unfold its activities, its presence across the entire territory. And therefore, I think there's going to be a very, very difficult, crucial issue of the relationship, the mandate between what the continuing IDF occupation forces do in Gaza and what this International Stabilization Force will do in terms of communication, deconfliction, command and control, rules of engagement. I mean, I think, the worst nightmare of many of the Arab states is a repetition of the UNIFIL experience in Lebanon, whereby the UN for many years has had the force in southern Lebanon, ostensibly to observe a ceasefire, and neither Hezbollah or the Israeli forces ever, let's be frank, really respected its role or mandate. Both sides have fired upon the UN forces. There have been a number of deaths, and I think Arab states would definitely not want an international stabilization force to start looking like the UNIFIL experience in Lebanon, where both sides would manipulate it rather than really respect it.
I wonder then how much concerns of legitimacy factor into this. Obviously, a lot of the Arab states, Egypt and Jordan most so, but even the Gulf states have been worried about perceptions of legitimacy after the onset of this war, protests from their own populations. I wonder how much that factors into their decisions in terms of both an openness to taking casualties, but also, like you said, being seen as simply manipulated by one side or the other, the image of, let's say, Arab on Arab violence in that scenario.
Yes, I mean, I think it doesn't help, of course, that the United States has made clear that it wants other people to do the job, but isn't willing to put boots on the ground and participate itself. There's a chicken and egg situation. You need an international stabilization force to go in to fill the vacuum, and there is a vacuum at the moment in terms of law and order and governance. Who's in charge, who's calling the shots. Hamas says, well, we can't hand our weapons over because who do we hand them over to? We're certainly not going to hand them over to the Israelis. So you do need that force urgently to prevent the vacuum again descending into chaos. But on the other hand, unless you have the mandate, the rules, the responsibilities of the force to avoid mission creep very carefully laid out, and the willingness of the parties to cooperate with that force rather than frustrate it, many countries will obviously be hesitant about sending forces in. And at the moment, it seems like the contenders are more Indonesia or Azerbaijan, who are, of course, quite distant from that context. There'll be Turkish troops, Egyptian troops, Jordanian troops who know the region well, but also, of course, have a good military reputation. Even eventually Pakistani troops might be in a more robust sort of position to enforce the mandate if called upon. But I think the other area, but that's one that goes to your question, on reconstruction, both the EU and the Gulf states have had extensive experience over the years of, spending vast amounts building, infrastructure, the Gaza airport, for example, ministries, all of these things, hospitals, only to see in the next round of fighting, all of these things totally destroyed. So I think, for the time being, we're going to be talking more about clearance, more about refugee camps, more about, basic services, but people living in, if you like, better tents to get through the winter, and seeing to what degree any sort of peace process actually sticks with some assurance that it's going to last before I think we're going to see Gulf states or the EU, who obviously are being called upon by the United States to pay for the reconstruction, to spend large amounts there. And of course, in Europe, we now have the World Bank assessing the reconstruction of Ukraine, which is an immediate European concern, at just under $500 billion. And that, of course, is a gross underestimate. So Europe, of course, is also mindful that it's going to have a big bill for Ukraine in addition to Gaza. So I think the clear thing, at least, is to get the stabilization force in and some competent transitional technocratic administration that can take care of the humanitarian needs. But long-term reconstruction is going to depend upon a much more reliable political settlement than what we've seen in the past.
A lot of ifs and buts and untils.
Unfortunately, yes, but inevitably so too.
Say it does happen as such, and there is an agreement to decommission Hamas, and it converts itself into an exclusively political movement. Hamas is not the only group that Israel considers its foe. It has considered the past 2 years, in fact, to be a multi-front war. And one of those fronts is in Iran, as you mentioned, Hamas's military backers. Despite Trump's claims that everything has been totally obliterated, and he was encouraging the Israelis when he spoke to their parliament to reach a peace deal with Iran. Israel is obviously less keen on that, particularly Mr. Netanyahu, who has made it a center point of his career to be very hawkish on Iran. I wonder now, if the fighting in Gaza settles, how Israel will think about Iran, whether it might turn its attention there or to the occupied West Bank where tensions are simmering. How do you think it's now looking at these arenas?
Well, my sense is that, yes, as long as Prime Minister Netanyahu is in power, he will continue, because he's built his whole career on opposition to Iran and warning about the Iranian nuclear threat and the like. But here, I don't think that the alignment with the Trump administration against Iran is quite what it used to be. I mean, Trump recently has been putting out feelers to Tehran and suggesting that he's willing to negotiate. He's even suggested that he's willing to cut a nuclear agreement with Tehran. He, of course, continues to criticize the old JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, negotiated by the Democratic Obama administration. But actually, what he's actually been talking about is something which is not so dissimilar when it comes to lifting of sanctions, which have recently been snapped back, of course, in the UN Security Council by the Europeans. He's talking about giving up nuclear processing, the return of course, of role for the IAEA and the like. Of course, part of the military campaign that the United States led during that 12-day war, going after some of the Iranian nuclear facilities, was to put Iran more in a sort of frame of mind where it would be prepared to negotiate. And so I would not exclude that Trump may distance himself from Israel on this particular point by being much more optimistic. Now he feels that, he's on a roll as the global peacemaker heading towards a Nobel Peace Prize, that he can fix any problem and he can fix the US-Iranian issue at the same time. The one thing so far, though, is that Trump really hasn't followed up in concrete terms after the US strikes against Iran in trying to get the Iranians back to the negotiating table. But let's see how that works out. And I think were that to be the case, and Iran does come back within jurisdiction of the IAEA in terms of inspections, limits on processing, all of these kind of things, that this would make it harder for Israel to continue to see Iran as the source of all problems. But the one thing, of course, that the JCPOA did not do at the time, which was to address the so-called Iranian regional activities in terms of support for Hamas, Hezbollah, for the Houthis, for the groups, the popular resistance movements in Iraq and elsewhere. And that was the criticism of the Trump administration, of course, and Israel of that agreement. So if you could have an agreement that looks at the nuclear issue, while at the same time Iran making commitments, not to supply these various movements across its borders, also to get out of Syria, now that we have a new administration in Syria and a Syrian leader that obviously has also reached out to the United States. I think there is a diplomatic opening here, but whether Trump will have the willingness against Israeli resistance to actually pursue this, I think is a question that remains to be seen. On the other hand, the Iranians saw during the US and Israeli strikes that Russia did not come to their help, despite Putin having agreed a defense deal with the Iranians. They didn't quite get the international support that they were expecting. And this may also, I think, lead them in a direction where they may be willing to compromise. So it's not guaranteed, but I don't think it's necessarily going to be a replay of what we had in the past.
Given that reorientation of Iran and its allied groups do not look the same as they did before October 7th, obviously having been severely weakened by confrontations with Israel, is there still the motivation among Gulf states for normalization with Israel, for an expansion of the Abraham Accords, if we're especially thinking about Saudi Arabia, if Iran they no longer perceive to be the main threat? And just on the back of that, if not Iran, what would you say is the main threat or the main flashpoint to watch in the region?
We have got Israel's sort of enemies really on the back foot. We're talking about Hamas. We're talking about obviously Hezbollah. We're talking about some of the the movements in Iraq. We've still got Israel active against the Houthis and also, of course, in Syria as well. But I think the mistake for Israel would be to feel that it's probably best off with a number of sort of completely destroyed and highly weakened neighbors, such as in Syria, such as in Lebanon or in Iraq, or of course among the Palestinians, because although yes, this weakness means that its enemies are weak, the continuing vacuum, particularly what we see in Lebanon today, the lack of governance, the lack of economic growth, the periodic Israel sending its forces back in, is only going to reproduce at a certain stage, even if they're not called Hamas or Hezbollah, these violent anti-Israeli radical movements that over time will resurface. So the hardest thing I think now for Israel is to realize that strong, stable states on its border are better for it in the long run than a series of failed states on its border. One rarely benefits from having failed states as a neighbor. So can Israel do something which Israel has always found difficult to do, frankly, in the past, which is to transform military success against its adversaries into a long-term diplomatic strategy to stabilize the region? And the Abraham agreements were good in the sense of taking away friction points between Israel and some of the Gulf states. Like after the peace deal with Egypt, Israeli tourists could go and visit Abu Dhabi or Dubai. But what they haven't done is produce the degree of diplomatic coordination of working together with the Arab states as true partners for the overall stabilization of the region. There's been a lack of, if you like, a common diplomatic project. And I think, again, this is an opportunity, maybe not for Netanyahu, but for whoever will emerge as leader after the elections in Israel next year. I don't honestly see Saudi Arabia or other countries joining the Abraham Accords until they see a little bit more into the future of how willing Israel now will be to try to stabilize the region as a whole, rather than think that it's fine and leave the rest of the region as a wreckage. I think it's a miracle of the war, particularly after Israel's strike against Qatar and the terrible suffering of the Palestinians. I think it's a miracle that those countries that did sign the Abraham Accords, like the UAE, have not backed away from them. But keeping an unsatisfactory arrangement is far less desirable than transforming it into something much more diplomatically worthwhile.
Thank you so much, Jamie Shea, former NATO official, for your time speaking to us. It was a pleasure to hear your insights on the region. Thanks so much for speaking to Middle East Eye today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity.